On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, is the U.S. Navy heading to Venezuela? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, a pretty substantial deployment of U.S. naval assets into the Caribbean, dealing with the country of Venezuela. Now, Venezuela has had a long history of interaction with the United States. We're going to look at this from the perspective of what units are being deployed down to the region, and more importantly, what does this mean regarding shipping, because that is the heart of this channel. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. But let's take a look at this story from Reuters in GCAP. A large buildup of U.S. naval forces in and around the southern Caribbean has officials in Caracas and experts in the U.S. asking, is the move aimed at combating drug cartels, as the Trump administration has suggested, or is it something else entirely? 7 U.S. warships, along with 1 nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, are either in the region or expected to be there soon, bringing along more than 4,500 sailors and Marines. President Trump has said combating drug cartels is a central goal for his administration, and U.S. officials have told Reuters that the military efforts to address threats from those cartels. Stephen Miller, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, said on Friday the military buildup was aimed to, quote, combat and dismantle drug trafficking organizations, criminal cartels, and these foreign terrorist organizations in our hemisphere. Now, back in early August, the United States doubled its reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to $50 million over allegations of drug trafficking and links to criminal organizations. Venezuela's Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, and the country's ambassador to the United Nations, Samuel Moncada, have said that the U.S. is threatening the country with the Navy deployments in violation of international treaties. According to Venezuela's defense minister, quote, Venezuelans know who is behind these military threats by the United States against our country. Now, the article does make reference to the age-old trope of gunboat diplomacy, which is something the United States has been guilty of in the past. Now, it should be noted that while there are large naval forces in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, the Pacific Ocean is a bigger route for maritime trafficking of cocaine to the United States. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes in its 2023 report on cocaine, citing figures from the USDA, it shows that 74% of cocaine flowing north out of South America is trafficked over the Pacific. Traffickers use airplanes to send cocaine northward through the Caribbean, the report said, naming Venezuela as a major hub for such departures. Mexico is the main source of fentanyl into the United States, with drug cartels smuggling it over the border. Now, is this an intervention against Maduro? Asked if the White House was ruling out regime change, a senior administration official said, quote, right now, they're there to ensure that drug smuggling does not happen. The Maduro regime is not the legitimate government of Venezuela. It is a narco-terror cartel. Maduro is not a legitimate president. He is a fugitive head of this drug cartel. That was from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Okay, so a lot going on here. Let's kind of break this down. First, the United States has increased its military presence in and around the Caribbean and what is referred to as the SOUTHCOM area of the world. Now, the U.S. divides the world up into geographic combatant commands, and SOUTHCOM is the Southern Command. This entails the Caribbean, the Central America, and South America. And in particularly the U.S. 4th Fleet, which is one of several numbered fleets in the United States. 2nd Fleet is in the Atlantic. 3rd Fleet is in the Eastern Pacific. 5th Fleet is out in the Persian Gulf region, 6th Fleet, the Mediterranean, 7th Fleet, Western Pacific, but 4th Fleet covers the Caribbean and areas around the Americas, have been reinforced recently. As a matter of fact, we can expect to see an expanded U.S. military presence there, according to the commander of NORTHCOM, who is providing assets to the SOUTHCOM commander. Now, as was referenced in that article, gunboat diplomacy, nothing new for the United States. The United States has exercised a lot of intervention in this region going back to the 1800s into the early 1900s. This famous image of Teddy Roosevelt carrying the big stick is a classic example of this. So let's talk about the assets that have been deployed. This graphic comes from Ian Ellis over on X. I'll have a link below where you can go ahead and link right over to it. It has a great capture here of all the major vessels that are in and around the area. One of the vessels to make note of here is the USS Lake Erie. A Ticonderoga class cruiser just came through the Panama Canal heading northbound. It is now in the Caribbean Sea, believed to be somewhere off of Colombia or Venezuela. There are at least 3 Arleigh Burke class destroyers in and around the region. One is in Panama on the Pacific side, 2 are on the Caribbean side. The USS Iwo Jima and its strike group, containing the USS San Antonio and the USS Fort Lauderdale, are down in the region. They carry a Marine Expeditionary Unit. A MU is a Marine Air Ground Task Force. It is a little bit of everything. It's something the Marines do extremely well. They bring in ground troops, they bring in aviation units, they bring in logistics, they put it all afloat onto 3 U.S. Navy vessels. They have helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, they have amphibious capability through landing craft utilities, through LCACs, landing craft air cushions. It is a well-rounded Marine air-ground task force. Now, while a MU is a hard-hitting unit, it is just a battalion in size. So we're talking about, roughly around 700, 800 troops, nowhere near enough to take on Venezuela by itself. We should also note some other assets. One, USS Newport News, which is a Los Angeles-class attack submarine. Several Coast Guard vessels, along with a littoral combat ship, the USS Minneapolis-St. Paul, and then aviation elements, including long-range surveillance aircraft, including U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon air surveillance aircraft. I think what this tells me, based on the makeup of this force, the logistics involved with this is a monitoring force. This is designed to provide a big visibility over aircraft coming in and out of Venezuela. Those Arleigh Burke class destroyers, the cruiser, along with all the other assets, are meant to really provide a net from which to monitor flow of ships and aircraft in and out of Venezuela. This is really not designed to be an amphibious assault force that's going to go in and invade Venezuela. However, it could easily be reinforced into one later on. These are usually the beginning moves that you start to see. However, right now, what you're seeing here is the establishment of Coast Guard and U.S. Navy vessels to monitor Venezuela. Come over here to marine traffic. You can see traffic in and around the area. Here is Venezuela in the very northern part of South America. Close, but not really astride the main shipping lane between the Pacific and the Atlantic, heading through the Panama Canal. There is a lot of traffic that is coming around the Cape route, southern Africa, up along the northern shore of South America here, that goes right past Venezuela, heading to the strait here between the Yucatan and Cuba into the Gulf, and heading to American ports in and around the Gulf, along with Mexican ports. So a lot of energy. Those red dots there represent tankers coming in. Obviously, Venezuela has a massive amount of resources to itself. Venezuela is one of the richest countries in the world, has one of the largest oil reserves out there, mineral, gold, you name it. It is a treasure trove. It has just been poorly managed over the years. And what I want to talk about here is the background on shipping now for Venezuela, because I think the shipping issue is a big one. So we know a lot of this has to do with the drug trafficking. President Trump has come out very strongly against the flow of fentanyl and other drugs into the United States. The initial bout of tariffs that was levied against Canada and Mexico had everything to do with control over the borders. Well, Venezuela has been an ongoing one, and not just the President Trump's administration, but in past administrations. Taking back to October of 2023, U.S. easing Venezuela oil sanctions. President Joe Biden's administration easing sanctions on Venezuela's oil and gas sector almost immediately in response to the 2024 election deal reached between the Venezuelan government and the country's opposition. The U.S. imposed tough sanctions on Venezuela to punish President Nicolas Maduro's government following his 2018 re-election, which the U.S. and other Western governments rejected as a sham. This is back during the first Trump administration. Since 2019, U.S. sanctions have banned state oil company PDVSA from exporting to its chosen markets. The officials, speaking on conditions of anonymity, said the U.S. was broadly relaxing energy-related sanctions, but was prepared to reverse those steps if Maduro's government fails to lift a ban on opposition presidential candidates and release political prisoners. Fast forward to March of 2025, Trump says nations buying Venezuelan oil gas face 25% tariff. President Trump said he would seek a 25% tariff on any nation purchasing oil and gas from Venezuela, citing migration and criminal gang members in the U.S. Potential move reminiscent of an oil sanction would particularly affect China, a major purchaser of crude from the South American country. Venezuela is also a significant supplier of crude to the U.S. April 2nd is when Trump has said he will announce sweeping reciprocal tariffs on nations around the globe. Exports of Venezuelan crude has risen to a 5-year high in February, before the Trump administration said it was forcing Chevron Corporation to wind down its operation in the country by April 3rd. Trump's comments follow efforts by Chevron to secure more time to conclude operations with the Venezuela state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. Come to April of 2025, on Good Friday, an aging supertanker fully laden with oil and calling itself Vidara arrived in the waters to the east of Malaysia after a 2-month voyage from Venezuela. The vessel raised red flags, 32 years old, past the age it would normally have been scrapped. It was sailing under the flag of Comoros, a flag of convenience that makes ships harder to monitor. For all intents and purposes, though, it seemed like any other so-called dark fleet tanker that carries barrels of something, sanctioned oil from producers like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, except it wasn't. The real Virata, which wasn't sanctioned, had actually been demolished in Bangladesh in 2017. This vessel was known as a zombie or phantom ship, which take on the identities of scrap tankers to appear legitimate and avoid scrutiny from authorities in the U.S. and elsewhere. At least 4 zombie vessels have emerged in recent weeks in the sensitive Venezuela oil trade, which has become even more risky since the Trump administration imposed tariffs on countries importing oil from the South American nations. So we don't just have ghost fleets now. Now we have zombies. Yes, zombies. May 2025, traders have rebranded more than $1 billion of Venezuelan oil shipments to China as Brazilian crude over the past year, according to 2 tanker tracker firms, company documents, and 4 traders. Independent refiners in China are the main buyers of seaborne oil shipments from countries sanctioned by the United States, with offshore Malaysia serving as a key transshipment hub for Venezuelan and Iranian crude. Since July 2024, however, traders have also rebranded Venezuelan oil as from Brazil. This has enabled tankers to sail directly from Venezuela to China, skipping the stopover in waters off Malaysia and shortening the voyage by about 4 days. Washington has imposed additional sanctions on Venezuelan energy exports since 2019 to reduce the oil export revenue that funds the government of President Maduro, who has held power for more than a decade with elections that observers say were fraudulent. So what we had here was tankers sailing from Venezuela, heading through the Panama Canal, heading across the Pacific, and not going directly to China, but instead come to this massive anchorage right here off the coast of Malaysia, where you see all these vessels anchored outside the EEZ of Malaysia. They would do a ship-to-ship transfer. They come alongside each other. They pump that oil into another tanker, perhaps mix it with some other oil, and then sail to China or someplace else. And they sit there and say, this is clean oil. It is out of the sanctions from Venezuela. What's happening now is they're not even doing that. They're just sailing and saying, hey, this is not Venezuelan oil. It's Brazilian oil. And unless you sit there and monitor and go back and check it, you don't know. And they're basically trying to save that time that it usually takes to make the voyage down to Malaysia, do the offload, transfer, and then back up again. Then we have July. Venezuela exported some 844,000 barrels per day of crude and fuel in June, an 8% increase from the previous month, as the loss of U.S. and European markets were offset by more cargoes sent to China. Washington in late May terminated a group of licenses that had authorized partners of oil company PDVSA, including Chevron and Repsol, to take Venezuelan crude bound for U.S. and European refineries. The state firm had ramped up exports to Asia since, selling its crude and fuel through little-known intermediaries that make deals with independent refiners in China. The cargoes include shipments of Boscan heavy crude, which was previously exported by Chevron to the United States. A total of 27 tankers departed from Venezuelan waters in June, carrying an average of 844,000 barrels per day of crude and refined products and 233,000 metric tons of byproducts. Oil exports averaged about 779,000 per day in May. Then just last month, 2 tankers chartered by Chevron carrying Venezuelan crude reached U.S. waters on Thursday, marking the first U.S. imports of the South American country's oil following a new license granted by Washington. U.S. Treasury Department last month issued a restricted license to Chevron, allowing the U.S. company to operate in the OPEC country and export its oil after a 3-month pause, triggered by more strict policies towards sanctioned Venezuela. The Mediterranean Voyager and Canopus Voyager loaded Venezuelan Boscan and Jamaica crudes earlier this month after negotiations with PDVSA, which is Chevron's partner. The tanker planned to discharge in Port Arthur, Texas, and New Orleans. 2 other Chevron cargoes that set sail from Venezuela this month also are on their way to the United States. Chevron's chief executive, Mike Wirth, early this month said that the flow of Venezuelan oil to the U.S. would resume in August in limited volumes. Chevron, which is in the first quarter, exported some 252,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil to the U.S., typically processes a portion of the crude at its own refineries and sells the rest to independent refiners, including U.S. Valero Energy and PBF Energy. Venezuela government has rejected the U.S. sanctions, and they said this amounts to an economic war against the nation. All right, so confusing to many out here. Why is it we have a large naval force and presence off the coast of Venezuela? We have sanctioned Venezuelan oil. We are upset about the transfer of Venezuelan oil to China. And then last month, we took 2 fully loaded oil tankers of Venezuelan oil in the United States. Well, a couple of things are at play here. Number one, Venezuelan crude is perfect for our refineries in the United States. We're used to cracking basically a very heavy type of crude oil. Unfortunately, the type of oil we're pulling from the U.S. through fracking is a much lighter type. It doesn't work very well inside our refineries. So one of the things we have to do is get this heavier oil. So we're literally in this weird situation in the U.S. of exporting crude oil and importing crude oil at the same time. I mean, they're literally passing each other through the Yucatan Strait. It's a weird thing. Now the U.S. has this large military presence off the coast of Venezuela. Again, this has a lot to do with the issue of fentanyl and drug shipments, along with illegals coming into the United States. This is a large enough force to get attention, but not large enough to stage a military incursion into Venezuela. What these vessels can do is provide a sensor blanket through the region, assisted by drones and other vessels, both afloat drones and aerial drones, along with aircraft, to monitor everything coming in and out of that airspace. So I think what you're seeing here is a very visible kind of big stick policy being executed by the Trump administration. It's interesting to note that the force that's down there right now is not being reinforced. We haven't seen any other movements. The logistical vessels heading down there, I've seen one underway replenishment vessel heading that way. So we're not seeing a huge movement of forces into the region. We're not seeing mobilization of forces in the United States. So definitely an element here that's meant to be a little bit of big stick against Venezuela. But the question becomes, do we continue to allow the export of Venezuelan oil? Venezuelan oil, along with Iranian oil, Russian oil, if you sanction that and keep it out of the marketplace, that is going to force other oil up into its areas. Remember, the U.S. has just upped sanctions against India because India has been exporting huge amounts of Russian oil into its country, refining it and sending it back. Now we're seeing, again, more action being done against Venezuela. It is very confusing. And if I confused you in this video, I'm sorry. But that's how confusing this situation is. At one hand, we're sanctioning and we've got military presence. On the other hand, last month, we're accepting crude oil into the United States. That's our policy. And to be clear, it's the policy of many administrations. It's not just the Trump administration. I know people want to blame President Trump's administration. I am all for blaming administrations when they do things hypocritical. And the Biden administration, Trump administration, Obama, I mean, you go back all of them. There's always moments where you sit there and you can't quite be clear what they're trying to do. In terms of shipping, this is a big one because, again, Venezuelan oil is really key for the Venezuelan government. They need to be exporting that to do it. They don't have the refinery capacity. Matter of fact, gasoline is really expensive in Venezuela. You would think a country that's afloat on oil would have cheap gasoline, but they don't have the refinery capacity. And as Venezuela deals with this, you've got issues on the border with Venezuela and Colombia, Venezuela and Guyana. I mean, lots of issues in and around around South America. Definite place we need to be paying attention to. Plus, being astride the Panama Canal right there, key shipping routes through the Caribbean. This is right up our alley when we've seen what the Houthis have been able to do with diverting shipping around the Horn of Africa. All right, hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. Till our next video, Sal, signing off.